Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Mac Hayes. I did public forum debate for 4 years. I now do American Parliamentary Debate, APTA for short. This is my fourth year doing it at Brown University. So I've done a lot of debate, and I'm here to talk about some cool philosophy concepts I think apply to debate, especially high school PF, in ways that people aren't really thinking about very much. So in high school PF, especially, we have all of these familiar concepts of models like claim, warrant, impact that lots of people know about. Claim is the statement you're making, warrant is why that claim is true, and the impact is like why we care about it in terms of like who it affects or why we care about it in the context of the round, maybe. So there's an interesting video that I watched recently by this great channel I would encourage you to check out called Kane B, who makes a lot of cool philosophy videos that I think are widely applicable to life and also debate. So do go watch that, but the video is called Infinitism. So infinitism is this really interesting concept. The idea basically goes like this. You take your standard claim warrant impact model, or any model for that matter, of just like, the assumption that some argument requires a reason for you to claim that it is actually in fact true. So for example, if I drop this pen, it will fall. This is a claim, right? I need a reason to explain why this claim is true, just like I do in any logical system. And so maybe my reason is gravity, right? If I drop this pen, it will fall because gravity will induce it to fall. But there's a problem with this, and this is extrapolated by infinitism to all chains of logic. That it seems like you kind of need extra reasons on top of that. Like you need a reason why your reason itself is true. So why, in this case, is gravity true? How can we ensure that this is actually something that has reason behind it instead of just something arbitrary? And there's actually two ways that I think about applying this. It's kind of like on the internal link and the link level, where like every single warrant is itself its own claim. And there's two ways that you need to explain how it is sufficient to prove the original claim true. And that's the internal causal logic. So gravity causes the pin to drop. How, right? Like assuming that gravity is in fact a concept that is true, how does gravity then ensure that in this situation, the pen will drop when I let go of it? And then secondly, also like, how do we know that gravity is true? We need to prove that as well. So we need a warrant for the warrant as well. So there's kind of like a little gap between the claim that is the warrant and the claim that the warrant is seeking to actually reason and explain. There's a gap between those two, and there's a further gap before the warrant. And both of these are little holes in the argument that require you to fill them if the argument is to be like thoroughly reasoned or like sufficiently reasoned for causal logic to hold. And the issue is that this appears to apply to anything. Like you can replace dropping pen and gravity with any argument, any claim, any arbitrary warranting. And so this appears to be an issue because you can always ask the question why, right? Like even if I do answer that question about gravity, why is gravity true? Well, we've observed gravity to be true. You can still ask those why questions. Like one, how do you know that you can apply these observations of gravity being true in the false and in the past to this current situation that has to do with the pen? And two, why have you observed this? Like why should we trust your observations? Why did it happen to be observed in the first place, etc.? And the problem is twofold here. There are kind of like three ways this could end. Either we get to an eventual line where we say, okay, we've reasoned enough, and this is something that is just like a truth in and of itself, or some like foundational truth that we have reasoned from. And the issue is that this seems like it never actually happens. Like a lot of philosophers have attempted to do just this. Think about like Descartes, for example, with the whole radical doubt system of like basically doing this, of constantly asking why until you get to only like, I think, therefore I am, and then try to work back up to everything else. The issue is that, of course, he had to use some assumptions like God exists in order to actually do that. Which seem a little suspect. And if you actually take the strong radical doubt stance, seems like you can't really build yourself back up to any foundational truths at all, or really any reasons. because you always have to doubt those as well. And so the point on arbitrariness goes like this. It's that if at any point in this reasoning you say, well, that's just how it is, you throw your hands up in the air and you say, well, I can't give you a reason why gravity is like something that exists. It just is. We just know it is. And I can't give you a reason why we can apply like centuries of scientific knowledge into the future. That's just how it works. That's just a common sense. It's just obvious. Then it seems arbitrary. Like if you can't give me a reason for something, then that's an arbitrary line. Then your reason doesn't have itself a reason, and so can't really be called fully or robustly sufficiently warranted. And then the second issue is that maybe you would say, okay, maybe it's not quite an infinite chain of reasoning. Maybe it like circles back on itself, which seems like the only other possible possibility. But this seems like obviously wrong. Like we would reject any circular logic if I said A is true because A, then anyone who disagrees with A would look at me like I'm crazy, and rightly so, because this is like completely incorrect logic. And so the only other way that this could go, which is what infinitism says, is that it's an infinite chain, that you never ever can actually get to the base truths. Every single argument that you give in support of a claim does require its own argument in support of it. Every warrant is a claim that requires another warrant. And this actually does legitimately apply to every warrant, no matter what the argument is. Which then means it's sort of seems impossible to fully warrant anything. So there's two possible conclusions of this in terms of how it applies to public forum debate. One is that maybe the conclusion out of this is like it's a skepticism argument, right? That you should default neg or presume neg because it is impossible to prove any argument true in the debate. And this is maybe intuitive for two reasons. One is that speech times are obviously finite. Like you're never going to be able to if there's infinite warrants that need to be given for any particular argument and there's not infinite time in your speech, then you can't give all of the warrants that are necessary to actually reason the argument. So there's always the possibility that they just stand up in their rebuttal and they just ask why. And then it's like, well, you can't give enough reasons. So then it seems like a good reason to doubt all arguments, at least in the context of the round, where traditionally debaters assume that you need to prove, there's like a burden of proving an argument true before the judge can vote on it. So if you haven't sufficiently proven that it is true or reasoned, then it seems like maybe the judge just shouldn't vote on anything and should therefore just vote on presumption or something. And second is that brains are finite too, right? Like we can't conceptualize of infinite warrants in our heads because we don't have infinite like capacity for reason or infinite capacity for knowledge. And so it seems like maybe the entire process is sort of futile. We can only like get closer to the endpoint of infinity, but really we're not actually getting any closer because 1% of infinity, there is no 1% of infinity. That's infinity. So any finite amount that you get, any like 10 warrants in or 20 warrants in, like it's still going to be infinitely close to zero in terms of how much of a reason burden you actually have. I think that the better way of interpreting this is not skepticism, because we all do debate for a reason. We all do debate assuming that it is a game that we can play that has some sort of ability for us to actually come closer to truths together, and that reason is in fact somewhat possible. So maybe it is true that like we can't ever get to fully reasoned arguments that are like 100% logically consistent, but that's not really what the game of debate is about. And I think that people who believe that it is are sort of fooling themselves. There's like a weird stance that is happening among judges where they sort of pretend that like tabula rasa means they will like drop anyone if they don't tell them why the body's metabolism means that eating food stops starvation, which I don't think is possible for any system of debate. And I think that the act of doing debate or attempting debate, or even really like living, like education, communicating with other people, sort of requires some baseline assumptions that we can have some amount of reason, even if it like maybe logically is infinitely insufficient to actually like logically justify and objectively justify the arguments that we're making. So instead, I think that this poses a different problem for PF debate, given that I don't think judges will be very amenable to voting on this like skep trigger in many cases. But it does pose like a real problem, regardless of who your judge is, regardless of if you actually are consciously thinking about infinitism at any given point, which is the problem of constrained optimization. So the issue is that it seems like if you warrant an argument, one of two things can happen, right? Either the judge believes that your warrants are insufficient, in which case there's no offense coming off of the argument, and so they can't vote for it, which means you've wasted your time, right? If you spend any time making an argument that has insufficient warrants that the judge won't vote for, even if it is dropped and extended, then it is just a complete waste of your speech time, and obviously something that is bad for you, because even if your opponents like answer it, if they're good, they will probably spend less time on it than you do. So it's just a time sink for you. Or second, you overcorrect for this and you do too much warranting, right? Like you explain why the metabolic system of the human body is such that it converts calories that you intake from like food exports into energy that prevents starvation and death. And then that's like obviously too much because no one cares, right? Like the judge isn't gonna would not have voted against the argument in the absence of these warrants. And it doesn't seem to particularly strengthen the argument that you have these warrants because these are not something that the opponents were likely to contest anyway. So it's not like this is like a preemptive frontline or something. This is just part of the argument that seems totally unnecessary to the round itself and not really helping you at all, in which case it is also a waste of time to be making these warrants, right? You are either always undershooting the warrant sufficiency bar, or you are always overshooting the warrant sufficiency bar. And it's a problem because either way, you are wasting speech time in doing so. And it's also a problem because the bar is like a moving target. Every judge has a different subjective idea of what is sufficient enough to be warrants, to like completely create offense off of your argument. And it's a problem because it seems completely arbitrary, right? Like there isn't any particular reason why we say like, oh, it's fine that you say nuclear war leads to extinction because of nuclear winter. And we don't like question that more. It seems like maybe some of this is actually just like the bar for sufficiency for warranting has gone down just with a greater amount of these arguments being read. Like the more common an argument is, the lower the bar for warrant sufficiency goes because people already understand it and have like accepted it as some sort of a social truth. So like one trend that I've observed in PF, for example, is that people don't really care that much anymore if you warrant whether or not nuclear war, for instance, causes extinction or even climate change. This is like strange, right? Like obviously the average everyday fella who's walking around, if you told them like climate change is going to cause extinction, they'd be like, I'm not so sure. Even like scientists, right, don't believe that climate change is necessarily going to cause extinction. And so it's odd that, and even like nuclear war as well, which seems like the most common one or most intuitive one. Most scholars don't believe that nuclear war would cause extinction. Certainly not most nuclear wars. Even the biggest ones probably would not actually cause extinction. And yet these arguments fly around, and not only do they fly around so often, but they fly around without really much warranting at all. Like people will throw out like, I don't know, star 15 or whatever, be like nuclear winter, the atmosphere is going to burn, or all of the plants are going to stop getting light to them for some amount of time. And so like people are going to starve. But that's kind of it. And the climate change ones maybe are even worse. Like the most common card I hear for that, for the internal link, is this one piece of evidence that says like it'll create nuclear resource wars, and then it just assumes that nuclear war causes extinction in the card. It just like maybe it even just says the word extinction or says like human survival, and then that is just taken as sufficient. But it's not just taken as sufficient by the debaters, it is taken as sufficient by the judges, which is a trend that is very different than how judging used to be in PF, where it used to be the case that if you made an argument that nuclear war would cause extinction, 9 times out of 10, the judge would look at you funny and just refuse to vote on it. And so in order to combat that, you would have to give way more warranting than you think you need in order to sway them in your favor and make it like I think the calculus that goes on in some judges' heads is like, they think, I don't want to be interventionist, and I identify myself as a tech over truth judge. And so I need to justify my ballot in a way that seems tech over truth. Now, there are two tech over truth ways to justify a ballot. You can either justify it by saying, you haven't sufficiently warranted this offense. And so even though your opponent hasn't answered it sufficiently, whatever, you didn't make enough warrants in the first place. And this seems intuitive from a tech over truth perspective, right? Like it seems wrong to say that, like, on this topic, for instance, about student loans, I can just get up on the neg and be like, if student loans are forgiven, then Vladimir Putin will die, and that will solve the Ukraine conflict. Like, clearly you do need warrants for arguments. Even the most tabula rasa judge would not vote for that argument, even if it was like clean conceded or whatever. If it was like, blipped in the last 4 seconds of case, and then like extended into summary and final focus. Like, okay, yes, your opponents haven't answered it, but it never had an argument in the first place. There's no reason and there's no evidence for why this would happen. And so a tabula rasa judge would still not vote for you, even if you did weigh this argument, because you never proved that it was true or even attempted to prove that it was true in the round. You just asserted that it was true. And so this seems like a perfectly fine thing to do for someone who identifies as tech over truth. Or they will say, I don't want to intervene. This argument has been warranted so much that if I do intervene against it, it seems like it crosses a threshold at some point for where I can't say like, oh, you didn't warrant it anymore. Because now if I said that, the debaters would look at me and they'd be like, what? I spent like 2 minutes warranting this, and then I warranted all the warrants, and I warranted all those warrants. Then it seems like the judge probably should not intervene on the round and say that this argument is wrong, especially if it was conceded, or if the opponents didn't answer it sufficiently, or if like the line by line ended up in the favor of the argument. And so there's this weird arbitrary thing going on here where like the debaters have to spend enough time giving arbitrary warrants and arbitrary warrants for those warrants, but the amount of time they spend doing that just depends on their judgment of how likely the judge is to take the warranting they've given as sufficient. And this in turn depends on how common the argument is on the circuit, and other like strange things like that. And so what's happened, in my opinion, is that over time, as nuclear war causes extinction has become more common on the circuit and it has become more accepted on the circuit, the amount of warranting that is optimal for teams to give has gone down, because it is no longer valuable for you to give like all of the necessary, or all of the like what used to be necessary warrants for nuclear war causes extinction, because you would just be wasting time, because people see, oh, this panel of 3 judges who are all very technical, they just voted 3-0 on this nuclear war argument, even though its extinction scenario had no internal warranting. And so that is a signal to me that if I give internal warranting, it is just a waste of my time. Clearly, the best of the best judges have voted on, have like decreed that it is unnecessary, and so it is completely a waste of time for me to do that. And it is probably true, right? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, other judges do learn from the standards set by these judges, and other judges do probably get lazier and lazier in upholding this like this standard of warrant sufficiency, especially when it feels more interventionist the 5th time you vote against a team just because they didn't warrant nuclear war causes extinction or something like that. Especially if this stuff is not pointed out. And that's actually the other weird thing, is like the first arbitrary thing is that this seems to depend strongly on how often this particular argument is run. But second, and also very weirdly, is that it seems to depend in large part on how much your opponent calls you out for not warranting something sufficiently. Like, it seems like a judge is more likely to think of themselves as interventionist if they vote against an argument for not having a warrant that the opponents did not call out, or that the opponents explicitly accepted, versus the scenario where it's the same argument, but the opponents have said, there's no warrant between part A and part B of the argument, and so you can't vote for it. In that like in that scenario, I think most tech over truth judges would be much more inclined to vote against the team, given that they don't have sufficient warranting. But it's weird that like just calling someone out can like radically change the bar the judge has for the sufficiency of warranting. And it's strange too, because I wonder why people don't do this more, given that it does seem to like really affect the line on warrant sufficiency. I think the reason why is because like even though it takes like half a second to be like, oh, they didn't warrant this, it's a really risky gambit, because the judge, you're kind of asking the judge to intervene as well. Like if the judge believes that they did warrant it, then your response is useless and it's a waste of time. But also it might come back to bite you. Like there have been plenty of rounds where someone says, this isn't warranted sufficiently. And they turn around and they say, oh, well, if we're using this standard of warranting, then yours isn't warranted sufficiently either, which is probably true, right? And the fact of the matter is that there isn't a coherent standard. And so this can always be done. There's like this weird, like mutually assured destruction effect where like, if I call you out for not having enough warrants because of infinitism, you can call me out for not having enough warrants as well. And we'll both be right. And there's no way of determining who has like more sufficiently warranted something. And so the problem is like no one is really willing to call other people out for not having a warrant, except in very egregious circumstances. But even then it's like egregious in what way, right? Like egregious in not being a very commonly run argument, egregious in like having a lot more like a bigger gap between the starting point and the ending point, I guess. But even that seems like a strangely arbitrary standard. So I guess that the conclusion is that really judges always have to use reasonability with these weird standards that change over time. And getting into the judge's head on this is something that is, I think, very useful. And the other implication is that I think this implies some like, it explains maybe some of the reasons why the meta in the circuit develops in the way that it does. I think that teams don't like risking innovation because of this logic, right? That judges can actually always feel justified at a technical level of voting against an argument that seems like totally reasonable in any other like era of debate, or even other like other circuits, other events, other formats. I think this is why you always hear of people having these massive disagreements about arguments across time. Like an argument that might be totally common and stock today in PF probably would not have been winning 8 years ago in PF, not because the argument is bad, or because there were better arguments back then, but because, and also not because the judges are more interventionist back then is the other thing. I think people often think like 8 years ago, judges were just like happy to intervene against everything. I actually think that even if you took the exact same like people who are judging today and had the same philosophies and you just transposed them back in time, if they were adapted to that circuit and the norms of that circuit, even if they were still tabula rasa to the extreme, they still would not vote as much, or as they would not be as likely to vote for an argument from 2023 that was used then, simply because the norms were different and it was less common. And innovation is more likely to be punished, right? There's a huge risk of innovation. The idea is like, you don't want to commit yourself too much to the innovative argument, knowing that there's a risk the judge can intervene against you. And so you don't want to spend too much time of your case fleshing it out. But that creates a terrible problem, because if you spend less of your case fleshing it out, then there's an exponentially higher chance that the judge does feel comfortable intervening against the argument, which means the optimal amount of time to spend on an innovative argument shrinks to zero. And so you don't run it, right? Because like you wouldn't want to spend all 4 minutes of your case on this incredibly like squirrely innovative argument, because there's a risk that you have no other offense to go for. The opponents will probably find good ways to respond to it. But also just that, like, if you commit yourself entirely to this one argument, then the judge might intervene against it, even if it is the most warranted argument in the world, simply because it is very new. There's like a real risk of that happening. But then it's like weird, because if you spend 3 minutes on it, then like the minute that you've given up of warranting is like the most important thing. That's like you now only have the bare bones, and you're taking out, because you have to structurally, you're taking out the warrants that make it more reasonable for the judge to vote for. And so as soon as you start shrinking it, then the optimal strategy becomes to continue shrinking it all the way to zero, which I think means that this explains a good deal of why people don't run incredibly innovative arguments. They always stay like on the edge of the Overton window. And why there is an Overton window in the first place, even in an event that is supposedly so tabula rasa and so accepting of all kinds of arguments. This explains also why like Ks have only now started to become common and still aren't completely, because judges do feel technically justified in voting against them if they are less common. And probably explains why we won't see like a lot of very, very different arguments in the future, with the sole exceptions of arguments that have already been run successfully in other formats like policy or LD. But you're unlikely to see something that has never been run in any one of these other formats. Like you wouldn't have an argument from like APTA, which is a pretty niche format that is relatively closed off from a lot of the other high school formats. We might have like some crazy arguments about like constitutivism and stuff. And you probably would not ever see that in a PF, because you have to do the legwork of converting it into the language of PF. And even then, there's so many risks of running it that make it really difficult. The reward, obviously, is that people won't know how to engage with it. And so if you are able to do it effectively, like innovation is rewarded exceptionally, but only if you're able to word it in a way that is palatable to judges and makes them feel more interventionist for not voting against the argument than for voting for the argument, or not voting for the argument than voting for the argument. I think that's the calculus you always have to use, is you have to explain these arguments in a way that makes the judges feel less technical voting against them than voting for them. So yeah, that's my conclusion about infinitism. Whenever anyone says you don't have enough warrants for this argument, this seems to be the answer. But also, you should warrant things sufficiently, because I think that makes for better debate, and it is probably what more judges want. After all, if judges understand your argument, which is really probably the most important thing, they will be happier with the round and more likely to award you good speaks, etc. So yeah.